is you can add the questions at any time to the chat, and we'll answer what we can at the end. We'll also display Sofia Baillet, the project lead's email at the end. So if we don't have time to get to your question, if you could email it also to Sofia, we'll reply by email. And maybe actually if someone could put Sofia's email in the chat now, people can just have that to hand. And as Zoom has just told you, and you would have seen from the Eventbrite invitation, this session is being recorded, and we expect to make the recording available publicly. So please make sure you're happy to appear in the recording if you have your camera on, or if you don't have your camera on, that you're happy with any name or description of yourself, which is showing to appear in the recording. Finally, just to say that this webinar will be conducted in English, but the Zoom version we have should allow you to get Spanish captioning. And Lucila will explain shortly in Spanish how to enable that. If we could move to the second slide, please. This is just to briefly explain the structure or the agenda of the session. Today's presentation aims to share an overview of the learnings from the pilot on worker engagement in human rights due diligence. And we will also be publishing a learnings report later today. The report will be available on the Laws and the Flex websites from this afternoon, and we will also aim to email a copy to anyone who signed up to this webinar. As you can see on this slide, the topics we will aim to cover during this webinar are why we decided to pilot worker engagement in human rights due diligence, why it's important to engage workers in service sector supply chains, the key issues raised by a sample of outsourced cleaning staff, how our pilot was designed and implemented, and learnings from the pilot before we have time for questions. And as I said earlier, just add your questions to the chat at any point during the webinar, and we'll engage with those at the end. So finally, I'll just introduce briefly our speakers in the order that we'll hear from them. So we'll first hear from Lucila Granada, who's the Flex CEO, and Lucila will cover the premise for the project. We'll then hear from Gisela Valle. She's the director of the Latin American Women's Rights Service, and Gisela will talk about worker engagement. And then we will hear from Sofia Baillet, and Sofia led this project and will cover examples of issues found in the outsourced cleaning sector before she, together with Lucila, share learnings from the pilot. So thank you very much, and I'll just hand over to Lucila if we can move on to the next slide, please.
Thank you, Kate. And I'll share a bit about Flex in a second, but just to share with those wanting to see the Spanish subtitles, I'll give the instructions in Spanish now, so bear with us. Para ver los subtítulos en español, lo que hace falta hacer es hacer clic en el icono abajo a la derecha que dice mostrar subtítulos. Van a ver en la barra de herramientas que hay esa opción. Y si al activar esa opción no les aparece directamente los subtítulos en español, pueden hacer clic en la flecha que aparece justo arriba de ese icono. Solo tienen que asegurarse de que en la primera línea aparezca la opción inglés y en la segunda aparezca la opción español. Entonces, vamos a pegar estas instrucciones en el chat por si alguien necesita revisarlas. So I'm going to start by sharing a bit about Flex and how this pilot came to be, as Kate has mentioned. Flex, or Focus on Labor Exploitation, we are an organization working to end labor exploitation by addressing the systems and structures that make groups of workers vulnerable to abuse. Last year, we celebrated our 10th anniversary. So for 11 years now, Flex has been researching, discussing, and thinking about solutions that work for workers in several high-risk sectors. We've looked into sectors such as agriculture, food and parcel delivery, hospitality, construction, fishing, and of course, cleaning. So if you're interested in our wider work, please have a look at our website and publication section. And I say publications because we conduct research, and most of our research is done using qualitative methods. So basically speaking to workers and documenting their experiences by having direct contact with workers, either ourselves or then through our strong network of partners, of frontline organizations that we collaborate with. We do evidence-based policy work and coordinate 3 advocacy coalitions. And we deliver training to community organizations that are directly supporting groups of workers at risk, as well as to statutory partners. And of course, we work with industry partners in cleaning, but also in fishing to help bridge the gap between research and practice. So in 2021, we published a report that some of you may have seen that is called "If I Could Change Anything About My Work." This was a participatory research done with cleaners. And in this report, what we explored were the risks, but also the resilience factors for workers in cleaning. And we documented many of the issues that we will be discussing today. I won't get into the details of this. But what I wanted to mention was the methodology. We engaged a group of workers as peer researchers for this work, applying a feminist participatory research action approach. The workers, that meant that the workers were involved in every stage of the process. So from developing the questions and the outreach plan, to conducting interviews and doing the surveys, to discussing the analysis with our team, drafting the recommendations with our team, and also in disseminating the findings. They were, of course, trained and coached throughout the process, and obviously, of course, also remunerated for their work. But what this meant was that we had the opportunity to have longer-term engagement with the workers, and that made a massive difference to the findings. We were able to ask much more nuanced questions and to identify much better informed recommendations that we could issue to government. So to give you an example, it was a group of women working in cleaning, actually Latin American women working in cleaning, who made us look into sexual harassment and to start highlighting that the UK at this point has no public body with the 3 necessary components: the remit, the power, and the resources to effectively protect workers from sexual harassment. And you will see that sexual harassment is still very much present in this work. So in this pilot, we're engaging workers to develop a human rights due diligence framework that can help assess potential risks of private sector service procurement on working conditions. We piloted this project in the cleaning sector, though of course the learnings are also applicable to other outsourced service sectors. Next slide, please. And why cleaning and why outsourced cleaning? Cleaning is characterized by widespread labor abuse and exploitation. The research that I mentioned and also research from LORS identified a range of common issues in the sectors, going from issues with pay, lack of sick leave, dangerous working conditions, and work-related violence, such as sexual harassment. I won't speak about these findings, as Ana Sofia will go over some of the key issues that we've identified through the engagement. But it is important to mention that cleaning is a feminized sector with a large number of workers facing additional vulnerabilities, including migrant and BME women. And on the other hand, the outsourcing or the poor procurement of services is a key driver of risk for workers. The competition for contracts and the pressure to reduce costs create a strong downward pressure that is clearly having an impact on workers' wages and working conditions. This you can see in examples such as when companies cut down on personal protective equipment, or in the excessive workloads that you often find in cleaning, the continuous intensification of work. And in the UK, this is happening in a context where labour market enforcement is severely under-resourced, so not properly equipped to address these issues, and where workers face significant barriers in accessing the justice system. Outsourcing also makes it harder for workers to organize and unionize, and all of this often leaves them with no options but to accept, to tolerate these abuses at work. So next slide, please. So for this pilot, we engaged a group of Latin American women who had experience working for outsourced cleaning companies. And I should clarify that we did not engage directly with outsourced staff in companies' own supply chains. As for this first phase, we needed to develop the very initial tools that would allow us to engage with industry partners. We will develop the protocols to ensure that workers from the company's supply chains are adequately protected throughout the process in the next phase. But for this phase of the pilot, LORS was our engagement partner. LORS, or the Latin American Women's Rights Service, is an organization with extensive experience supporting women in cleaning. And I'll now pass over to LORS Director, Gisela Valle, who will speak further about the importance of working with women workers in these processes. Over to you.
Thank you. LORS is Buy-in for Latin American Women's Rights. Buy-in for Latin American Migrant Women's Organization. We're a human rights feminist organization addressing the practical and strategic needs of Latin American women in the UK. On the practical side, we offer advice and counseling in areas of violence against women and girls, labor exploitation, immigration, access to welfare benefits, among others. And on the strategic side, we carry out policy, advocacy, and campaigning on violence against women and girls and labor exploitation. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the part that LORS supported the project with, which was the worker engagement. So the rationale to do this work, as Lucila mentioned, is to ensure that there are effective mechanisms of protection of labor rights. Sometimes we know, particularly in sectors that are precarious, outsourced, and where there are high levels of labor rights violations, things don't get reported. Usually what happens is that workers prefer to leave their employment instead of seeking redress for any employment rights violations. There is a need to better understand the workplace dynamics, particularly those that might be widespread but don't give rise to grievances, and better understanding of dynamics affecting by the intersection of layers inequalities. For example, those based on gender, but also disabilities, race, among others. Obviously, it's alongside these benefits, it presents a challenge to conduct this type of worker engagement because precarious working conditions mean that workers tend to move on from their employment instead of using the available tools at their disposal to seek redress. That means there is not a lot of documentation of how these things happen and to whom, and with that, and with what level of continuity these things continue to happen. It's really people just leave, and that therefore leaves with no, there are no records of this happening. In terms of engaging workers, it is difficult for them to set aside the time to participate in this type of project, as their income can be directly affected if their ability for work is not what their employer is expecting. So we just continue to be through a massive cost of living crisis. And that means that for a lot of the women workers coming to LORS, it was a difficult decision between working additional hours, even if they're not paid, and being available for their employer and accessing services and this type of research. Obviously, we work with a migrant community, so that means insecure immigration status means that workers are not always willing to risk raising some of these issues as they feel that they might be impacted in their ability to work or their immigration status. Of course, this project was done by two voluntary sector organizations, so obviously there is no data sharing, but making the case to workers who are already very, very afraid of interactions with anyone is a challenge when recruiting for this type of project. And of course, overlapping layers of inequalities means that power imbalance is something that it's very difficult to draw out in the nuance of what this means. Intersectionality is a term that's used widely across the sector, but the understanding of the effects of intersectionality is a bit less understood. So having considered all of the challenges, we engaged the cleaners for this project with a design that was informed by our experience of working with this specific group. These drew on our cultural, linguistic, gender, migration status specialism, which has been developed over 40 years of experience working with Latin American migrant women. As I said in the beginning, obviously LORS is a buy-in-for organization, which means all the people who support the organization, either the employees or the volunteer, we come from the same community that we are serving. So that helps inform of that. And then we consider, although we're going to talk a little bit more about that later on, what is accessibility measures? So thinking about language, thinking about culture, thinking about issues of connectivity, thinking even things like time of the day when you can do the engagement was important for us to make sure that we were not forcing only the few that could attend during the time that we were thinking of, but trying to give the widest possibility for women just say, yes, we want to be part of this project. As will be discussed later on in the project, workers in high-risk sector have key insights into the risks that they face as a result of their direct experiences. Their knowledge can not only provide information on the reality of working conditions, but can also provide invaluable insights into how better to prevent the risks they are facing. When communities that are most affected by issues can actively participate in research and advocacy, they can help generate knowledge and bring about lasting change. I think there's also, it is also important to highlight that for women workers who participate in this type of project, there is a personal benefit, not in the sense of gaining anything other than being able to be heard about their experiences, to be able to discuss their experiences, and to be able to understood in how these experiences have shaped their working conditions. It's important to reflect on the knowledge that people gain through direct experience and how it might be different from other types of expertise. For example, relying on written documentation about working conditions such as policies may not give an accurate representation of what is taking place in practice. A clear example of this was mentioned in the workshop on health and safety when a participant mentioned that being forced to sign documents stating that she had received health and safety training when she had received no such training despite having requested it. And I think Ana Sofia is going to talk a little bit more about this, but this kind of having things in paper that were not being done in practice is quite common in this type of employment. I think it's the next slide, please. Yes. So obviously there are, as I said, challenges that come along with worker engagement, including finding ways to reduce barriers to participation, such as language, travel costs, availability, and safety. In the case of this project, LORS drew on knowledge from existing community organizing work with women workers, which we have been doing, I think, since 2017, to inform efforts to create trust during workshops and help participants to feel safe and open to sharing their experiences. And we had a fantastic community organizer that really understood how best to engage and create that trust and safety that is needed for this type of project. For this project, 8 workshops were held online and in Spanish by female members of staff. Whilst online discussions allow participants to join from different locations and save participants time and money from travel, it can sometimes be challenging to establish a safe space for participants to share their experiences openly. For example, for women workers who might be in things like lunch break or commuting from one place to the other in the bus, it's sometimes a bit of a challenge to ensure that they're able to speak about when they're in public spaces. Other challenges might include participants having connection issues and other technical difficulties which may cause withdrawal from the discussion. As I said, we had been supporting women workers through community organizing, and that means that we develop with the community organizing group specific house rules for participation that were both drawn by the participants themselves, but also agreed with participants and themselves which made it a lot easier for us to go over how the information drawn up on the different sessions we had with the group were going to be used and what was going to be discussed in and outside of the project. And I think that's it from me. Thank you. Now I'm going to hand over to Ana Sofia.
Thank you so much, Gisela, for your presentation. So we're now going to dive into some of the issues that were raised by workers and some of the gaps that often exist between company policies and just the day-to-day realities of cleaners. So we want this project to be constructive. That was definitely one of our aims, and for companies to build their understanding and really be proactive. Also for companies to get a better sense of where to start. So I'll run through some examples of actions that we co-developed with workers to prevent risks of labor abuse and exploitation in service sector supply chains, mainly cleaning. So as Gisela mentioned, we engaged workers to discuss their experiences across the key areas of concern in this sector. But for the purpose of this presentation, and because I only have 10 minutes, I'll only focus on a couple, which will be working hours and pay, health and safety, and sexual harassment. The remaining areas will be covered in our report, which we'll publish later today. So definitely take a look at that, please. Thanks, Olivia. So working hours and pay. Issues with pay, including underpayment of worked hours, illegal or unclear deductions, or not being paid holiday or sick pay, is by far the most salient problem facing cleaners. For workers who are already on a very low wage, and we're talking national minimum wage, which is around 11 pounds, a little bit more per hour, or the living wage, around 13, these losses of income have huge impacts on workers' ability to make ends meet, even like paying the rent. So yeah, just to give you an example, there's also another element that's linked to pay that only starts coming to light once you actually start talking to workers, which is that in practice, cleaners are often allocated short shifts. We're talking about 2 or 3 hour shifts in numerous locations across the city. Time spent traveling is not paid. Travel costs, so like bus fares, are not paid. Essential training that they have to carry out is often not paid. And the long waiting gaps between these shifts are also not paid. So while companies may believe that they're paying, let's say, the London living wage, around 13 pounds per hour, when we do the maths, the actual working hours for a cleaner in a full working day may only be a couple of hours. So the actual hours that they spent working and that they're paid for, which often brings their pay below the living wage and in many cases below the national minimum wage. So that's an example of a gap that you would have between policies and practice. So what ends up happening is that cleaners end up working really long days to supplement their pay. One cleaner sharing, for example, that they leave their house at 4 a.m. and return until 11 p.m. Another key point that was raised is that cleaners are usually compelled to sign their contracts right there and then, so right away, without having time to understand their terms and conditions, which obviously includes working hours and pay. These contracts are also often 0-hour contracts, meaning that there is no guaranteed number of hours. There are no income guarantees. The contracts are also in English, which they often don't understand. Participants also raised in this area that employers often miscalculate service targets to cut costs and deliver cheaper and cheaper services, meaning that cleaners are always under pressure to do more in less time. Next slide, please, Olivia. So what can be done to prevent this from happening? Improve understanding around how these shifts are assigned by service providers. Are workers traveling all around town? How many hours are they actually working and being paid for? How much level of manager discretion is there when assigning shifts? How is the workload distributed? I remember a cleaner saying, you know, it's not the same if you're assigned the bathrooms in the basement that the bathrooms in the main floor where everyone's working. So really know which questions to ask. Make sure workers have a couple of days to review and understand their contracts. Really assess whether service procurement benchmarks are enabling realistic and ethical cleaning contracts with service providers? Does the price that you're paying consider the living wage? Does it allow for suitable PPE, personal protective equipment? Does it allow for sick pay? Assess whether 0-hour contracts are used and really understand the impacts that these contracts have on service staff. Do workers in your supply chain know how many hours they'll work next week, how much they'll earn? Next slide, Olivia, please. Health and safety. So this is another significant area of concern that has been identified in this and previous research. In this sector, workers perform heavy or repetitive physical work. They also use very strong chemicals, and we're talking about like bleach. And they often do this without breaks or with the statutory minimum break, which for those of you who don't know is 20 minutes for every 6 hours. And this break, by the way, it also doesn't have to be paid. It depends on your contract. So cleaners are often asked to work without the necessary PPE, personal protective equipment. They raised, for example, that their gloves are often very thin, just very poor quality. Or if they are given shoes, these are usually unisex or one size fits all. So imagine working with shoes that are one size fits all. Also, the products and equipment that they move, for example, buckets of water, are very heavy, and workers are often denied trolleys or carts because of the pressures that suppliers have to cut costs and sell a cheaper contract. It was also raised by participants that they're often not allowed to use the lifts, instead being asked to carry the equipment up and down the stairs, like the emergency stairs, so as to not disturb company staff. I'm sure that most companies wouldn't want this happening in their supply chain. You know, sometimes companies don't even know that this is happening, and that information won't come to light unless they hear it from workers themselves. Cleaners also requested on the clock, so that is paid for, health and safety training in a language and format that they can understand. Cleaners are often given this like big manual, which is in English, and no real time to study it. Training is very important for the well-being of workers in this sector, but also for the effectiveness of the service delivery. You want workers to know which chemicals to use and where, which cloths are for the kitchen, which cloths are for the bathroom. So, you know, yes, well-being of workers, and that's a priority, but also to have your kitchen cleaned by a cloth that's for the kitchen. So for next slide, Olivia, please. Yeah. So for this area, health and safety, we learned that it's key for PPE to be suitable for the tasks required. It's also really important for PPE to be gender specific where relevant. Essential worker-informed training should be delivered during working hours. Really pay attention to the chemicals that are being used. Is there excessive, unnecessary contact with strong chemicals like bleach? I mean, for anyone who has used bleached, you know that that's really strong. So imagine using it for like absolutely everything. It was raised during the engagement that after COVID, so since COVID, bleach is just being used for everything. I guess it's cheap, and managers think that it kills the virus more, or viruses more. Make sure cleaners have adequate rest breaks, time to break, ideally beyond statutory minimums. Also review if there are arrangements made for pregnant women, so lighter work for pregnant women, which was also flagged as something that doesn't usually happen. Next slide, Olivia, please. So the final issue that I'll cover is sexual harassment, so work-related violence in the form of sexual harassment in the workplace. And as Lucila mentioned, this is a key workplace issue that is experienced by many women in the sector and also by men. It includes inappropriate comments on physical appearance, pressure for dates, sexual advances, And it is especially important in this sector because, as many of you know, cleaners often work alone or late at night on sociable shifts. Many workers fear reporting sexual harassment because it can put their job at risk. For example, it has been reported there are unexpected changes to the rota. So you think you have a shift next week and then they suddenly change it and you miss your shifts, or not being allocated shifts in the future if you say anything. Some of the issues experienced, for example, unwanted touching, hugging, tickling, are often so normalized that it is very common for employers to just sort of downplay or brush off these experiences and not really take effective action to investigate or resolve the concerns or the complaints. So another thing that is quite common in the sector is that workers have no separate changing rooms. Men and women usually change their clothes in the same room. Sometimes they don't even have a changing room, so they change in the emergency stairs, which often enables these situations of harassment. Next slide, Olivia, please. So to prevent these risks, there definitely needs to be mechanisms that are safe and that are trusted by women workers to raise concerns or complaints about sexual harassment. You can have a grievance mechanism, but if it's not trusted by workers, then no one will use it. It needs to be free from retaliation. Workers need to be able to know that there won't be any retribution, as I mentioned, in the form of not being allocated shifts, being, not being talked to, not being given training, and also adequate access to remedy. Also make sure that there is at-work training on sexual harassment and how to report it. Again, because this is so normalized, workers raised, like, where is that line? What is sexual harassment? What's appropriate? What's inappropriate? It's also really important for this to be delivered for workers, but also for service providers and for company staff. Cleaning is an on-site service assessment, an on-site service. So the harasser can be a colleague, so it can be another cleaner, but it can also be an employee from the lead company. It could also be a customer from the lead company, or it could be a worker providing another outsourced service, let's say catering, security, another service. So training really needs to be for all. Also check if there are adequate changing spaces for cleaners, separate changing rooms, if possible, and really understand safe and unsafe spaces in your own premises from the perspective of workers themselves. Next slide, Olivia, please. So these were just some examples of the issues facing cleaners and the actions that can be taken to minimize the risk of labor abuse and exploitation in the supply chain. And if we got all of these information and co-develop these solutions, imagine the amount of knowledge that we gained throughout this process over the past 2.5 years. And that is thanks to the voice of workers. So I really hope that it was evident that when we recognize workers as experts by experience and we engage them to co-develop these improvements, just the level of detail that we're able to achieve really is very high, meaning that the potential solutions are also just more effective. So now back to Lucila, who will explain more about the pilot design.
Thank you, Ana Sofia. And yeah, back to the pilot. So yes, based on this work, and of course, also based on extensive review of existing models and scoping done by Ana Sofia, and I should also say, also inspired by the principles and the impact of the worker-driven social responsibility model, we developed a worker-informed tool to assess companies' policies and practices against a set of indicators. And Ana Sofia referred to several of the areas we look into. And we use this toolkit to develop recommendations to workers. So to assess how they're doing against these indicators that are informed by workers, and then to issue recommendations. We're hoping that the toolkit will also help us track the implementation of those actions. And I'll give you a bit of information about this, more information about the indicators, to give you a sense of what this project resulted in. So we divided the indicators in 3 levels of compliance. So we have baseline level indicators. We might want to try and get a more creative name for this, for the next phase of engagement with workers. But baseline level indicators represent compliance with mandatory norms and regulations. We do have a focus on promoting practices that drive a positive impact for workers. And by saying this, I mean, there might be companies that already go beyond the minimum standards legally required, but we also look here at whether those standards and practices are properly embedded by the company in its operations. There's the strategic level indicators that represent the strategic integration of good governance standards into the company structure and practices. And here's where the company sees the improvement of labor standards for workers across the supply chain as a priority at the core of its business model. And the systematization of its standards ensures that compliance can be maintained in the long run. And finally, the aspirational level indicators. And these ones represent a more proactive, ongoing effort from the company to be at the forefront of social sustainability practices by continuously reviewing and improving standards, as well as engaging industry peers, authorities, and civil society actors to drive these sort of higher sector standards. Here, the company adopts a worker-informed approach and seeks workers' feedback in a systematic and meaningful way. And it seeks to inform its strategies and drive its effort for equal, improved labor conditions for all workers. Companies at this level also are actively engaging in advocacy activities, so really pushing for change across the board. So next slide, please. So what have we learned from this process? We have so far piloted this tool with 2 commercial companies, and we want to share a few learnings from this work. I'll share the first one, and then I'll pass over to Ana Sofia. The next slide, please. Yeah, thank you, Olivia. So the first learning, which is the one that I will cover, is that involving workers in defining the problem and shaping solutions can make efforts more impactful. And this refers back to what Ana Sofia was just saying. This is a central notion to this pilot, but also to our approach more broadly. And it's really recognizing the knowledge held by workers, which is gained through direct experience. And it's about valuing that knowledge and recognizing that their insights are vital to ensure that any solutions actually respond to the issues they face on the ground. And that the areas prioritized by this pilot, but by other programs, initiatives, actually do address the issues that matter the most to them. So in other words, ensuring that the efforts have a bigger impact on improving the situation for workers. Now, it is important to design this engagement in a way that allows workers the opportunity to share their experience and that knowledge in a safe way. So it is important that in doing this, we take the time to consider how to keep participants safe during and also after their engagement, and also how to reduce barriers to their participation. I'll stop here and pass on to Ana Sofia, but Kate, do let us know if we're doing bad with time. All right, thank you.
Thanks, Lucila. So yes, I'll talk about the last 2 learnings. So another learning from talking to many companies throughout this project, not only to our company partners, was that there's a big gap in knowledge on the working conditions in service sector supply chains as a whole. Until very recently, we've noticed that many companies hadn't placed enough attention on their procurement of services. It was mainly about the sourcing of goods. This being in part because when you outsource a service, you sort of expect that part of your business to be taken care of. And because there's no liability for the working conditions of those who are not directly employed by the company, the responsibility often just falls through the cracks. But as we saw in this presentation, companies do have a significant influence over the conditions of workers in their supply chains through their purchasing practices, especially with clean being an on-site service. Companies first have to check why these labor abuses are occurring and whether their business terms are contributing to these violations, really addressing the root causes of labor abuse and exploitation. So the influence companies have on cleaning contracts can really make the difference between workers having sick pay or not, or workers being paid overtime or not, or workers having cheap gloves that leak or not. And the way to identify and monitor all of these is by involving workers and their representatives, really moving beyond social audits, which may check, for example, that a worker signed a contract, but it won't really assess if this is a 0-hour contract or if it's bogus, false self-employment, and what this means for workers in practice. This oversight can mean that cleaners in the supply chain are ineligible for certain basic rights, for example, access to sick leave or maternity leave or time off for dependents or annual leave. Traditional audits may also confirm that the delivery of training is signed for example, based like on the quote that Gisela showed, but not really check if workers actually received accessible training in a language that they can understand, or if they retained all of this knowledge, which will change continuously with the provision of the service. Next slide, Olivia. So finally, last slide before we move on to questions, is that driving up standards across this sector will require more from companies. We know that legislative changes on HRDD in the UK in particular are being slow, but that doesn't mean that companies cannot be proactive and understand what's going on with their service staff, really understand why it matters and how to improve it from the ground up. We focus a lot on modern slavery and human trafficking, and that is crucial. But in service sector supply chains like cleaning, security, catering, maintenance, workers often experience labor violations like the ones that we just described, rather than more severe forms of exploitation, like trafficking. So what happens is that over time, these lower levels of exploitation, like accumulated unpaid wages, become normalized, which increases the risk for more severe exploitation later down the line, because workers are more likely to accept bad conditions, so precarious agreements. Another very important point is that, and I know that there's conversation around this happening, which is that, yes, we do need to identify issues facing workers. We need to assess company policies and practices, but none of this will make a difference if the changes are not actually implemented by a company and adequately tracked by companies with workers. So moving away from, the shiny reports that outline all of the issues that were identified to the what do we actually do? How do we change things? Companies have to be ready to change some of their practices. And we know that this is or can be resource intensive, and there's a lot of different areas to juggle within a company. But that's why risks and impacts are prioritized based on severity, based on likelihood, based on the most at-risk sectors. Not everything is done at the same time at once. So this journey also needs to be with the supplier. It can't just be requesting better and better conditions from the supplier. Companies need to support them to achieve these improved standards. But yeah, so that's the end for me. Thanks for listening, and over to you, Kate, for questions.
Thank you very much. So obviously I really want to thank all the speakers today, as well as the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust for funding this pilot project. So we've now got some time for questions. I already saw there was one question earlier in the chat, which Gisela answered also in the chat, but I wonder if it's worth discussing quickly here about who exactly outsourced workers are employed by. What is the model for outsourced cleaning? Who do the workers work with? Who are their contracts with, generally speaking?
Who is that question for, Kate? I think I knew.
Oh, sorry. Yes. Anna Sofia, well, Gisela answered it in the chat, so I don't know if Gisela, if you would like to just answer it verbally as well.
I mean, I can just recap very quickly and allow Anna Sofia or others today. So essentially, the model is that client companies decide to move some of their operations from in-house to outsource and hire companies to provide some essential services. In the cases we're talking about is the cleaning services. So instead of employing the cleaners, you hire a company. This company usually has contracts with multiple clients, meaning that the cleaners are assigned multiple clients. So they might go from an office to a hotel, back to an office, etc., etc. But the employer is just one company. It's just they work in the premises and they conduct the cleaning services for the clients. And with that, yeah, and that's Sofia. I don't know if I'm missing anything.
No, I think that you covered it, Gisela. Thank you.
There's the next question, I'm afraid, Gisela, I think is also for you. It's how many workers were involved in the workshops altogether, and has the approach taken enabled any kind of longer term worker organizing or trade union to develop?
So I would need to double check the notes to see the number of workers involved in the project, and I'll come back to that. I'll put it in the chat. So the answer is not exactly unionization, although we always support unionization of workers because we understand, and the actual report mentions that how it has a chance to improve working conditions, but we're not a union. So we don't conduct any kind of work on behalf of the unions, although we have worked with two grassroots unions particularly, which is IWGB and UBW, and keep kind of referring people from one organization to the other. What we have done and continue to do is community organizing. So it's a different type of model where you develop skills for activism within your community with particular members of it. The whole aim of the project is that these activists do not require the intervention from voluntary sector organizations, but are able to raise the issues either within the union or within their employing, not unionizing, but they're able to organize with others and look for solutions within them. It doesn't lead necessarily, because of the nature of the model, is not meant to lead to something necessarily completely organized that you can see. But it's really about being able to raise your voice, seek better conditions, but also support others in doing so.
Thank you, Gisela. The next question.
Just one thing that I'll add on that point, which I think was a good learning as well, is that we had during the workshops the same participants most of the time joining all of the workshops, and we definitely found that trust was built throughout this process. Trust is not something that you just have because we're Latin American, Spanish speaking, etc. But we could see how workers changed, how much they were sharing, how much they were understanding, and this really contributed to the level of detail that we were able to obtain, because the first workshops were, they would share, but everyone, understandably so, was a little bit more quiet, I guess. And then as the workshops went along and the level of trust built up, because we had been working together for a while, they would just share their experiences in more detail. So that's another important thing. Trust needs to be built, even if you are, you know, from the same community, even if you are an NGO.
Thank you, Anna Sofia. There's a further question asking about if the pilot can be replicated. So is the process in question standardized, and is the process transposable to other sectors? I wonder, Anna Sofia, if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yes, sorry, I'm just solving a crisis because my laptop is not charging, but I have my phone plan B. So yes, is the process and question set standardized? Can the pilot be replicated? So that is what we're exploring, which is that's why it's a pilot, it's a learnings pilot, which has been fascinating. Thank you for that question. Yeah, we do hope that this process is applicable to other sectors. Obviously, it would need to be adapted with the worker engagement element, etc. But that is something that we're definitely looking into. The tools, the worker-informed tools that we developed, definitely we did that. We developed them with this in mind. So that was one of our goals. So yeah, that's something that we're exploring.
Thank you. Could you, Anna, well, maybe Gisela actually, rather than all the questions going to Anna Sofia. Gisela, are you able to give any reason why the workers in the sample are unlikely to report pay concerns to national minimum wage enforcement within HMRC?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a complex question that I'm going to try and simplify as much as possible. So there are mainly two reasons why this happened. One is that all of these workers are subject to immigration control. And sometimes migrant workers in the UK don't understand certain rights are protected. They either don't understand what their own immigration status is and what they can ask and not ask for, or they might think that particularly when it comes to employment rights, they don't have any rights and nobody's going to protect them. Unfortunately, the way working in this sector works means that employers often reinforce that narrative to ensure that there's not going to be any employment tribunal claims or any sort of redress mechanisms available to these workers. The other one is that they don't understand how to navigate the system. I mean, the UK has a complex employment rights system in which you have 7 different type of agencies that protect certain different kind of situations happening at work. So it's unlikely, for example, that employees or workers are going to understand that they need to go to HMRC for wage protection, for example, and where do they need to go for sexual harassment protection, or where do they need to go for lack of sick pay protection, maternity rights protection. So it's a very complex system to navigate, which means that it's very, very difficult for workers to be able to navigate that. On top of that, you're going to have language barriers, for example, where the majority of these labor inspectorates do not have proper and actually fully accessible translation mechanisms. So that means if you don't speak English, it's going to be very difficult. You're going to be understanding what anyone can do. And where you have voluntary sector organizations like LORS that provide advice services to workers, usually there are a bit long waiting lists because the voluntary sector is a bit overstretched and overwhelmed when it comes to all types of advice, including employment. So it's a combination of not being very safe to raise some of these issues, not understanding how to do it, and if you decide to do it, finding the support and the help is going to be a bit of a challenge.
Thank you very much, Gisela. And we've actually just got a couple of minutes left until we end at 12 o'clock. We've got the further questions we'll make a note of. If you could, for admin, it would help us really if people could email the questions also to Anna Sofia, but we'll also make a note and try and send replies, try and track down the person who asked and send replies. And Gisela's kindly offered as well to have a chat. Thank you, Gisela. Just we do have time for another question. Have the workers been joining trade unions, and if not, what are the barriers? And maybe Lucila, if that's all right, could answer that one quickly.
Yeah, sure. I mean, a lot of the barriers that Gisela just mentioned also apply to this point, to be frank, because navigating systems, understanding what the options are, the language barrier, and the sort of difficulties in finding the right groups and the right people to speak to are huge barriers already, also for workers joining unions. But I would say also that, especially given the way in which this sector works, and I think this goes also to the question about the contracts. Cleaning is it's a very fragmented sector. So what you'll find is people having multiple contracts, part-time contracts, often most often actually 2 to 4 part-time contracts. They may be employed across, you know, different companies, organizations in the public and private sectors. And then there is a proportion that will be self-employed. A lot of times you'll find that it's bogus self-employment. And there are also agency workers, but mostly are on employment contracts. However, the amount of hours that they will be working are very limited for each one of this. And so being in low pay, that kind of insecure work, is very difficult for workers to prioritize, you know, paying fees for unions, but also find that useful, in the sense that, you know, more traditional models of organizing, or I should say current models of organizing, don't necessarily adapt to their working patterns and to those needs. So of course there are some grassroots unions that are sort of more adapted to these patterns, and that are you know, dedicated to targeting these groups, but that is also still very, very limited in reach.
Thank you very much, Lucila. Apologies that we've run 1 minute over, but thank you very much, everyone, to all speakers, to Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust, and to all the participants, including for your very important questions. And as I said, we will attempt to respond to those by email. And please do look out for the learnings report available on the Laws and Flex website later. Many thanks, everyone.